this weekend.
Yeah,
On Saturday, it got like 8 inches.
you're,
We were sledding and then we were also paddling around in our saturated hayfield in a utility sled and it can be a little bit. Just getting ready. Yeah,
All right.
it's going on now.
We're happy to have Maddie with us again from NOFA, Vermont, to talk about S60, the Farm Security Fund. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. For the record, Maddie Kempner, Policy Director at NOFA Vermont. I would love to just share a little bit with the committee about the background on this bill, where it came from, why we at NOFA and lots of others feel that it's needed right now. I'm happy to answer any questions throughout or at the end, whatever works for the committee. First, I want to share that NOFA has been working in support of this legislation with a really diverse group of farming organizations from all around the state, representing all types and scales of farmers. This group that you see up on the screen here started meeting last summer after the second round of pretty devastating flooding. And I will just say from our experience at NOFA and my personal experience, and I don't think I'm alone in this, the most recent devastating flooding that happened in July 2023 really put a lot of farmers and the broader farming community on our heels. And I think that summer was really categorized by a lot of trauma, a lot of chaos, a lot of scrambling to figure out how we as a state, I'm sure farmers individually were scrambling to figure out how to respond. Organizations like NOFA were scrambling to figure out how to respond. And it was really hard to kind of collectively wrap our heads what happened and what would be useful in the future in responding to those kinds of events. And I will just say for myself, in July 2024, when we had devastating flooding exactly 1 year later, it was much more clear. I think as a state collectively, a lot of people felt better able to respond because we had the resource pages that had already been created. We had, we knew what to tell farmers more so in terms of where to go to, report losses and where to go for support. And NOFA felt like collectively the ag community was in a better position at that point to say, what is a structural support that we can put in place so that when this happens again, because we know it's going to continue, we're better able to rapidly support farmers with what they need in that moment. So this group of organizations that you see here came together and started meeting last summer to start developing the proposal that turned into S60. And some of the things that we had really widespread agreement on as organizations and partners is that the Farm Security Fund is needed to provide assistance to farmers in the immediate aftermath of extreme weather impacts. We collectively agreed that it should be simple to apply for. It should provide as fast a turnaround on payment as possible. That it should be flexible and proportional to meet the needs of our farming community. That it should be permanently and predictably funded over time. And some of the other parameters that it's administered by the Agency of Ag specifically, in collaboration with this review board, which I'll talk more about, and that farmers should be reimbursed for up to 50% of their losses that are otherwise uncovered. And a little bit more background that I think is probably repetitive for you all at this point. The reason that we need this now, we are seeing, as you all know, consistent extreme weather and climate impacts here in Vermont. I think, frankly, lots of other parts of the country and the world have been facing these impacts for much longer. And I personally think Vermont has perceived ourselves as a bit of a climate haven. There have been news stories talking about Vermont as a climate haven. And that's one of the reasons that in 2023, the flooding was such a shock to so many, especially in Lamoille County, where I live. There have been studies showing that we were relatively safe from some of the worst impacts of climate change, and we were absolutely one of the counties hardest hit in July 2023 by the flooding. I also want to say it's not just about flooding. There are lots of different ways that extreme weather looks and lots of different ways that it impacts farmers. And I think it's important that this program that you all are considering at the state level address all of those different types of impacts and also address more localized impacts where they occur. So in July 2023, July 2024, actually also in May 2023, when we had the late spring freeze, there were federal disaster declarations. And I think that a lot of the farming community, when we were in the immediate aftermath of the flooding, were told, just wait until the disaster is declared. Wait until we have a designation from the Secretary of Agriculture at the federal level that this was a disaster and resources will come. And I think what a lot of farmers that we work with experience is that that isn't what happened. The disaster was declared and the resources didn't really come still, even after that, except in the form of low interest loans. And beyond those disaster level events, there are lots of other ways that extreme weather is showing up. So, flash droughts in parts of Addison County where, the other part of that county or, the neighboring town got lots of rain. There are lots of instances where these events are more localized, and even when they don't rise to the level of a statewide or county level disaster, those events still have just as big of an impact and as lasting of an impact on that individual farm. And we can't risk losing those individual farms, which is what we will do if we don't address it.
In Lindenville, Glen Village Road and up in Kirby, and that farm was cut off
Mhm,
for how long?
mhm.
How long?
Yeah.
Weeks.
Yeah.
Cut right off. And that was a localized event from down there up through to Morgan Holland.
Yeah.
And-
Absolutely. And then some of those folks are going into their local FSA offices and being told, all we can offer you is a low interest loan, or in some cases, not even a low interest loan, depending on that particular farm's circumstances. So we really need at the state level something that is much more responsive to those kinds of localized and unpredictable events. This number is the total damage and loss that farmers have reported over the course of the last two growing seasons. 58.2 million in total is the burden that farmers are having to deal with from these extreme weather events. These are the combination of 44.7 million in 2023 was the total damage and loss numbers that farmers reported in their applications for the BGAP program, and 13.5 million in 2024.
This is just what was reported through BGAP.
Yes.
I bet you it was twice that much then. Because a lot of people didn't apply for BGAP because
Yeah.
we never applied for BGAP. We had huge losses.
Mhm.
We just didn't apply.
I think the agency of ag would tell you this is a pretty conservative.
Brian?
And just as this is flooding too, that didn't include, say, the frost that hit all the orchards and berry growers.
This is just flooding. And I think that the estimate in the Ag Recovery Task Force for the late spring freeze was 10 million thereabouts. So
It's double that.
yeah, it's a big number, but it's a much bigger number, I think, altogether. This is another visual that just shows, this is all 2023 numbers from the Ag Recovery Task Force again. So the total damage and loss reported just from farm operations themselves was 44.7 million. The total reported damage, including other food businesses, was 69 million. And the total funding that was available through charitable grants, including our Farmer Emergency Fund, ACF Farmer Grants, and BGAP was 6.9 million. So orders of magnitude less than what we know is the need.
10%.
That 6.9 for farms, or was that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that just includes the 3.7 million that went out to farms through BGAP. And a little more on the data. So you can see here in 2023, there was 44.7 million in losses reported, 13.5 in 2024. The other numbers here in 2024, I have a little caveat here because some of the data from the BGAP applications actually isn't available publicly. If you go to the Agency of Ag's website, they have a survey dashboard up that you can look at. But that's only data that's showing the initial impacts that people reported in the first few weeks after the event in 2024. But you can see here, average income loss in 2023, 61,000, 65,000 in 2024. And that number I think is important to highlight because it shows that even though in 2024, the impact wasn't quite as broad, it wasn't, it didn't hit as many counties in 2024 as in 2023. The average income loss was actually higher for the places that were impacted and for the farms that were impacted. The average percent of income loss, 28% in 2024, 2023, 25 in 2024. And then I will say in 2023, in the initial survey that the Agency of Ag put out, 70% of those respondents had no crop or livestock insurance. In 2024, 57% of folks had no crop or livestock insurance. So you actually saw between those 2 years, and at least between the operations that were impacted, a slight uptick in the number that had some amount of coverage, but it's still woefully inadequate to meet Vermont's farming community's needs.
Representative O'Brien.
Maddie, what on average, on the dollar does farm crop insurance amount to? I mean, when you look at that, you're like, oh, well,
Yeah,
it's bad, but it's actually far worse because it's like, right, it's like
yeah,
20 cents on the dollar or something like that.
sometimes much less.
Yeah.
It depends on the program that you're talking about, right? If you're talking about the NAP is the one that most vegetable farmers, if they have anything, they apply for. It's the non-insured crop disaster assistance program. It's technically not crop insurance, it's a disaster program. You heard from Justin Rich, who came in and shared that he got about a penny on the dollar after his premiums were paid. I'm sure Bruce can probably speak directly to livestock coverage. And it would be great for the committee to hear from folks who have sort of a 30,000 foot view of crop insurance in the state and who is and is not covered.
Where crop insurance works best is if you're a commodity grower. And you book in your inputs. You book out the sale of your crop. A lot of them do that. The ones that didn't do it last year wish they had. They probably are doing it pretty good this year. And then they put in part of their cost of operating their crop insurance. So it works great for the I-states.
It is nice.
Indiana.
Iowa.
Man, you're smart.
Pretty crafty.
That is generally, Jake Jacobs was in, speaking to Senate Ag about crop insurance. She's been someone who's worked in risk management programs for a long time. And she was sharing the statistic that in terms of acreage across the whole country that's covered by crop insurance, the number is pretty high. Actually, it's something like 85% of all farm acreage in the country is covered by crop insurance. In Vermont, it's something like 9% of our farms that are covered. It's a really, really disparate amount of our farms in Vermont that have crop insurance compared to the I states. Maybe an M or a T state in Houston.
You see. So 23, we lost 300 acres of corn to flood. I mean, gone, just nothing to harvest. We may have been paid well on that. And we had another 300 acres that severely hammered because of soil saturation. And we may have been paid well on that, but our other 2,200 acres was a real good crop. So they would look at our total crop and they say, well, your loss is, it's not 25% of your crop, because your other crops did well, you lost, 10%. And you're not eligible for payment. Whereas if you are a commodity grower and your corn gets wiped out, they don't go in and harvest the fodder or anything. They just till it under, collect the check, and their inputs are covered and they have a little bit left over. And I saw a guy lost a beautiful corn crop, and I said, I'm sad for you. That's a beautiful corn crop. He said, what do I care? I got paid. And I unclicked. Because I just think that's a terrible attitude to have. Anyway,
We will, thanks for mentioning that. We'll reach out to
Well, Jake Jacobs is who testified,
in Senate Ag.
yeah. You could reach out to folks at FSA.
Yeah.
There's a few folks. The statistics are pretty easy to find also in terms of what the payouts have been for and not. There are 2 farms that are in theory designed to cover smaller, more diversified operations. Like ours in Vermont, there's the whole farm revenue protection program, and there's the micro farm insurance program. Both of those in the last, at least in 2023, maybe in 2024 also, had 0 farms enrolled because they just don't work. And it's not worth farmers' time to apply for a program that's not going to pay out. And that's pretty onerous in a lot of cases to apply for. So we are just emphasizing and coming to you all about this legislation that the existing support systems to support our farms here in Vermont are not there, they're not working, and it's really incumbent upon all of us to step up and collectively support farms because you saw that big number, that was an underestimate. Farms cannot afford to pay with that alone. I think the other thing that we want to emphasize and that we constantly hear from farmers is that farmers are doing everything they can to prepare for these events. Very few farms are just waiting around for the next event to see if they can make it through. Our farmers are incredibly skilled, incredibly knowledgeable, and they are putting in all of the practices and making all of the adaptations that they possibly can to get through these kinds of events, including changing entire business models. But we need them to be able to focus on that work. When these kinds of events happen, when extreme weather happens, we need farmers to be able to focus on learning and adapting as much as they can. And this immediate, quick turnaround financial support is critical to allowing farmers to focus on what they do best. So just a few more things for me. I wanted to share a little bit about the review board. We at NOFA have had our Farmer Emergency Fund in place since the 90s. And that whole time we've had an emergency fund review committee that's made up entirely of farmers and our membership who make the decisions about which farmers get funds. And we know because of that process that farmers have expertise that's uniquely held by them that people in state government just don't necessarily have. So we think that partnership between farmers and folks directly impacted, the working lands people directly impacted by these events, in partnership with the state government administering them is critical. It's not intended as a bell and a whistle in this policy. It's really important, we think, and all of the farming organizations agreed to making this work the best that it can. We think also that farmers being involved in the process will really help to inform and improve it over time. Farmers themselves can give input into how this process works well or doesn't, what issues there are with timing, the kinds of losses that are eligible, how the application process works for them. And that's really important too, that we have a feedback loop with state government so that farmers can make sure that this works for them well. It can help ensure equitable distribution of funds. I think, farmers having some oversight and some accountability of this program is also something that we've heard from farmers that they want and think is important. Gone over this already a little bit with you, but the federal crop insurance and disaster aid programs really fall short for Vermont farms. And I would say on this point in particular, I would encourage the committee to hear from crop insurance experts, but I would also encourage you to hear farmer stories about what it takes really to apply for these programs and make claims and how that often plays out in reality. And then finally, we have heard from so many farmers also how meaningful the support that they were able to get through BGAP was to them. I don't think there's a single farmer who got a BGAP that it was anything short of a lifesaver. It was an incredibly helpful program. And we know that we can use what we've learned over the last couple of years to design something better. And that's also what this bill is reflecting. So we know, for example, that the payment turnaround time for BGAP sometimes was 6-9 months following the event. It takes too long. We need it to be more responsive to farmers' unique needs. So there were some instances where, because the BGAP program was run through the Agency of Commerce, they just didn't think about certain losses that farmers were gonna face as qualifying for payments. And that's one of the reasons why we think that it's critical that this goes through the Agency of Agriculture, because they understand the kinds of losses that farmers experience in a way that the Commerce Department just doesn't. And we think they can help make it more accessible for folks who don't have access to the same kind of technology and are maybe less used to applying for state or federal support, which is really important for the farming community too. Again, it's not just about flooding. Representative Burt isn't here today, but this photo actually was from a 7 Days story about his farm suffering really significant losses from the late spring freeze in May 2023. Orchards who had losses during that time reported at least 95% loss. I said 10 million, it's actually 11 million, was the total estimate of losses from that event. This was a few weeks ago when I presented, but there was we talked about this in this committee actually, a couple of barns that collapsed under the weight of extreme snow loads. And it's important, I think, also for this committee to be aware, and I know many of you are because many of you farm or have relationships to farming. There are the well-known and well-understood losses that happen during an extreme weather event: crop and livestock loss, infrastructure and equipment damage, lost income. The ones on the right are also incredibly important to understand. So impacts to human and animal health, increased pest and disease pressure, decrease in feed harvest, feed quality, impacts to farm employees, damage to field access, loss of markets, loss of crops resulting in loss of income from value-added products, soil erosion, loss of soil fertility, and stress and mental health impacts. None of those should be overlooked, and in lots of cases, farmers are facing many of these at the same time. I can only assume, an incredibly overwhelming experience to deal with. And so again, emphasizing the need for these payments to be turned around quickly, the need for the application to be simple, so that farmers aren't having to jump through a lot of hoops to access relief during this kind of traumatic experience. Again, just emphasizing that this is a collective problem. We all rely on farms to eat, and we are all responsible for supporting farms as they face these new climate realities. So we are asking you to please support S60, the Farm Security Fund bill, and we have been asking for a $20 million appropriation for FY 2026 to make sure that farms have the resources that they need to recover from extreme weather going into this current growing season. That is all. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you.
Questions? Can you talk a little bit about when we took the testimony earlier this afternoon from Ledge Council, we noted that the bill had originally suggested a certain time frame for the response, processing the application. And I'll pull it up here just so I'm not trying to go entirely by memory, but 7 days changed to 15 days maybe. Just wondering whether you had any thoughts on the timing that ended up in S60.
Yeah, the original proposal was that they would have 1 week to review applications and then another 2 weeks to turn around payment. I think the change was made, my impression in the Senate Ag Committee at the request of the agency, felt like it was too short. We have emphasized throughout this process that they should be turning around these payments as quickly as possible. And we want the application process to allow for that. So I think we would still support the original language of 1 week to review. I also think that the original language still provided room for the agency to determine that an application was administratively complete. So similar to our process with our Farmer Emergency Fund, in our case, it's one guy, his name is Bill. He looks at every single application and actually has a conversation with every farmer who applies to make sure that all the ducks are in a row, that it makes sense for them to even go through the application process. What we had envisioned is a similar process at the Agency of Ag, where they would, receive the applications, folks at the agency would review them to make sure that everything was there and that it was complete before they passed it to the review board to review, so that they were only spending time reviewing applications that had everything in place. And then we really wanted to push for that 2-week turnaround because that's the timeline that farmers have to make payroll, is really what that was aimed at. We heard from a lot of farmers, especially in 2023, who were in a position of losing everything in the flood and then having a workforce who they had to decide potentially to lay off for the remainder of the season, which meant loss of income for those employees and also loss of any on-farm help to be able to recover for the rest of the season and replant for those producers. So that's why we were pushing for the 2-week turnaround.
So there's right now, the way that it ended up, there's 15 days from the point at which the complete application is received, the board has 15 days to make a determination, hold a vote, and then if it's approved, another 15 days to get the payment out the door. Are you suggesting that you think both of those should be sped up or one but not the other?
I think it is a question, I would suggest hearing from some farmers specifically on that question about what they think is really needed in terms of timeline. I would also say that it would be good for you to hear from the agency about what is possible. But I do think it's really important that the legislature puts language in statute that addresses that question of turnaround time and doesn't just leave it up to implementation, because we know, for example, with the EGAP program, how it has played out, and we don't want that. One of the things that we heard from the agency, specifically around the EGAP program, was that one of the things that ended up making these payments take a long time to get out, and they would go back and forth with farmers 4 and 5 and maybe more times, was just getting a complete and correct W-9. Which if anyone has filled out a W-9, it is not a complicated form. It's a very simple form to fill out, but it would get returned to the it's completed in the wrong color page, for example. So we really want to put some pressure on state government to address those kinds of issues, because again, farmers in this situation shouldn't be having to resubmit W-9 4 times and waiting months and months as a result.
The application needs to include a copy of Schedule F. And we will take testimony from the agency and from some farmers who can shed some light on all of these questions. But any concerns about requiring that tax form to be part of the application?
I think what we had suggested was either a Schedule F or an end of year statement, and like a profit and loss statement. And that was really suggested by the folks in our coalition who have worked on a lot of these kinds of programs with farmers. And it's part of the reason for one of those is ensuring that these are commercial operations, that these are real farm businesses that are applying for support. And the groups in our coalition were supportive of having some basic demonstration of being a commercial farm operation as part of the application. So I think we're fine with that.
Representative Boswell.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of numbers. I mean, I think it said 58 million, and you said that's actually really a low estimate. And the recommended designation for this was 20. And I know in the Senate, they actually at one point have been talking about 7.5. And I think here in the House, actually, we had a bill kind of like this last year that was around 5, maybe we were trying to get in, and appropriation still couldn't get that through. I guess I'm just wondering, if it turns out we can do this, but at a much more modest level than what you're requesting, how would it make sense for us to distribute? I mean, I think when you had it initially introduced, it was said it's just first come, first serve. So if we're expecting $25 million of damage, but we're not going to have that much in terms of funds, should it be a percentage that you get? Or should it how do you think we could make this fair to actually try and sustain people so that everybody can get relief, as opposed to you get your paperwork in first and then that's how you end up getting the funds? Because I think it's probably not likely that amount is going to come through, but I think we would like to be able to help it as we're able.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I will say it's really important to us to be clear that we know the need is at least 20 million.
Mhm.
We feel very clear about that's a real number. That's not a, we feel confident that is still the need for the last state growing season, where that was not the case. We haven't seen one of those in a while. So I think we want to be really clear about what the actual need is. And we also know that these events are not predictable and they're going to happen throughout the year. So I think that was another thing that very quickly our coalition had agreement on, was that this needs to be available throughout the year, because these kinds of events or extreme weather can happen at any point in the year, and it needs to be available on a rolling basis. So we couldn't really think of another way to have the application process work other than first come, first serve. And the hope is also that the ag agency will partner with all of the organizations who support farms around the state to make sure that folks know about it, that they're ready and prepared. We actually had initially thought about including something about having farmers serve as farm service providers, serve as navigators, or like insurance adjusters. That felt too complicated, but we really feel like there does need to be a strong partnership between the ag agency and lots of organizations that work on the ground with farmers to make sure that that there is as equitable access to the program as possible, because that is really important.
I mean, I guess I just wonder if say we have a deep freeze in May and then we have floods in July, there might not be anything left in July because all the money went out in May.
And we'll be back asking you all to put more money in at the following year.
Representative O'Brien?
So along those lines, you see it as a $20 million fund. Some years it may get totally cleaned out, other years only half, and so then the appropriation would just bring it back to 20 approximately.
Exactly. Yeah, and ideally the money stays in the fund because it's designed as a special fund. It doesn't, go back out of the fund into the general fund. If there is some left over at the end of the year, it rolls over and it stays there, and we can over time also work up to the balance that we know is really needed.
And there is a provision to allow other ways of other revenue sources here.
Yes.
So private donations, for example.
Yeah, the bill specifies, and I think this is also just true of special funds in general, that it can accept philanthropic donations and federal funds as appropriate.
Representative Nelson?
Yeah, think of it as preparing. If you prepare and a storm misses you, are you mad? Think of it that way. If we prepare and we start building a chest of money and the storm misses us, great. We can build upon it.
Yeah.
Because eventually it'll come.
So why don't we move on to whoever's going to be next? I don't know if it was Vern. Vern's next on the list, but we are happy to have you rearrange the list if you want.
Looking at you with the kiddo.
It might make sense for us to go if we can.
Yeah, is that okay with you?
That's fine.
It won't mix it up as much between.
I'm all for supporting the family.
Let's do that for pussy. Okay, awesome. Thank you all.
It's kind of like it just on your computer.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That's a good idea. I'll move it for now, but I can read.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Am I to go next or someone else?
I think you got bumped, Vern. Hang on a second.
Okay. Oh, great.
Graham, are you gonna,
I'm happy if that works for everyone.
if that's okay with you, Vern? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
Thanks, Vern.
The price of what?
Two for the price of one, yes.
I'm glad to see Graham's got supervision.
This is about retaining farmers in Vermont.
Yeah.
Graham Unang Strupanacht, rural Vermont, and this is Juniper Batten Unang Strupanacht. Until we figure out the name situation. I did write out my testimony. I sent it along to Sidonia. I'm mostly going to read from this today and then respond questions. And yeah, we'll start there. Some of this will be a little repetitive because you all have had me here before, you know who I am, but at least for the record, it'll capture. So my name is Graham Unang Strupanacht. I'm the policy director at Rural Vermont and a farmer in Marshfield, directly abutting the upper reaches of the Winooski River. Now, as a region which saw significant agricultural and non-agricultural impacts related to extreme weather events over the past few years. And I was really desperately trying to get this video off my phone yesterday. It kept being like, it's too long and too big. I wanted to show you all what my valley looked like the last 2 summers, but maybe at a future testimony opportunity. So Rural Vermont's a 40-year-old statewide member-based farmer and farm-led not-for-profit organization based here in Montpelier. Our mission is to organize, educate, and advocate in collaboration with local and global movements to strengthen the social and ecological and economic health of the agrarian communities that connect us all. As you all know, we work primarily at the local and state levels, but we also advocate and collaborate in national, international spaces with the National Family Farm Coalition, and through them with La Via Campesina, peasant and food sovereignty-based organizations, which is one of the largest social movements in the world. So I recognize this is the beginning of some of the testimony you're getting on this bill, but the stories you will hear today and you'll hear going forward, the testimony from farmers, from farming organizations and technical service providers like the Intervale Center, like Extension, like DOF and others, are the stories we hear and have heard and which inform us in our work on this bill and being here today as an organization. We're not an organization providing farm-based technical services for the most part. We focus on organizing, education, and advocacy. We do have extensive relationships across organizations and participate in networks, coalitions, working groups, and direct communications with many of these technical service providers on the grass tops end. And then we directly visit and work with farms and farmers and farm workers based on needs they bring to us. And we support them in working with one another in relationship to practicing farm-based skills and mutual aid, understanding and crafting, engaging with policy and the regulatory environment, helping connect them with, and their voices, with you all, with policymakers. So some of our direct on-farm support efforts, such as work brigades, actually started in the context of needs emerging from climate and weather-related farming challenges over the past few years. In relationship to this particular bill, Rural Vermont is one of, as Maddie pointed out, many organizations over the months prior to this legislative session that came to a number of meetings after over 2 years of excruciatingly very challenging extreme weather events dramatically affecting communities and farmers in order to draft this bill. So I guess one of my main efforts is to communicate the larger effort that went into this and how many different stakeholders were at the table. And I know Maddie already did that to a great extent, but this diverse group of organizations and individuals, we came together to discuss how our communities have been impacted, what's needed, and how we may work together to accomplish this. We know that existing programs, though a meaningful piece of the puzzle, are not adequate, and that we in particular need a program tailored to the unique needs and vulnerabilities of the ag community in Vermont that can quickly and efficiently mobilize funds in response to disaster locally. Maddie spoke well to that. We determined that a state-based fund, as you see proposed here, would be the most effective means and worked section by section to craft this legislation. We carefully considered the total estimated need financially based on known losses, or I should say estimated losses, as was pointed out from recent years, and a means of establishing a formula such that this need was updated and adjusted over time. We considered what was a reasonable need and the ability and cap for reimbursement. We discussed the most effective, efficient, and accessible and resilient entities for administering the fund in the event of disasters. And that's a time when capacity is already stretched and needs are quickly emerging. We discussed and determined what an efficient, effective, and accessible application and administration process would entail. And we discussed what types of losses would be eligible for reimbursement, types of events would be eligible weather conditions. We discussed the importance of a review board for being able to respond in a nuanced and on-the-ground way. And I think this is really valuable and important. This isn't something that we all get invited into at the federal level to talk about how these programs are going to work. We're here as a community trying to figure it out for ourselves, like what's going to work best for the people here. We knew, and you have heard or you will hear from farmers testifying to the fact that whether you are a medium or large farm that has purchased one or more forms of crop insurance, or whether you are a smaller or more diversified farm for whom crop insurance isn't a relevant option and you are using crowdfunding platforms or small grant programs as a means of response, this bill will help you in meeting significant remaining losses when disasters like we have seen affect your farm and you need immediate financial support to keep your business running, your staff employed, to get your crops replanted, or purchase in replacement feed or equipment, or any number of threats and impacts threaten to overwhelm your ability to respond and recover as a business and as a person. So according to the 2022 USDA Ag Census, 57% of all Vermont farms are unprofitable and lost a combined 85 million. That's 2022, so that's before either of the sort of like major flooding disasters we've heard about. And that's the most recent ag census we have. At a Vermont Farming Conference this winter, a farmer discussing their farm, the impacts of the floods, and their recovery also spoke to the audience in a very humble way, acknowledging that at the end of the day, he knows they don't have to be farmers and that they can choose to make a living another way. And I think we need to take seriously that we have amazingly skilled people doing this essential work, people who have chosen to do this regardless of the acknowledged relative economic marginalization of farming, which I just gave you a statistic demonstrating, who are making incredible contributions to our communities, to the progression of horticultural and agricultural practice, who hold skills which assure the meeting of basic human needs and which are increasingly rare, and who are on the edge of making a decision to stop farming in order to make a more secure livelihood, in order to have greater mental health and experience less stress, or for other related reasons. And when it comes down to it, farmers are just people, and they have their limitations. But based on what we know from the New England Feeding New England analysis, to achieve even a relatively small portion of regional food security, we need many, many more farmers. We need much more land in farming. And we need this to be more accessible location, for there to be accessible land, for there to be fair prices, and for this work to be compensated with just livelihoods. So this fund doesn't do all this, but it is critical in this era of significant climate change to meeting the emergent financial needs of farms in times of disasters, which may otherwise hasten the decision to close the farm or sell land or other assets to keep a farm going or take another job in order to support the family. This fund will both work to support current farmers in an already economically and climatologically challenging environment and work as an incentive to encourage more folks to farm in Vermont, as it communicates that we value farmers and farming and understand the necessity and vulnerability of this work in an ever more unstable climate. And I should say even more recently, in an even more unstable economy. In supporting farmers financially, this fund will also work to protect farmland from development and loss. It will support the engagement of farms with their local communities and economies related to businesses, and will support their communities and the region's food security and resilience. So please let us know if there are particular things you'd like to hear more about in relationship to this bill. As we spoke to, this is a large coalition of groups and individuals working on this with a lot of different types of expertise. And we deeply appreciate your work on this. I know to a great extent, we're probably speaking to the choir in this committee and when we were in ag. Thank you for your support in this bill and the work with this fund. Happy to take questions.
Thank you for your time, for
Absolutely.
coming in, because it's an important.
Thanks for inviting us. And for inviting Jennifer. I'm glad she gets to hang out here and see what this is all about. So.
She was on TV. She's taking that pretty good, Graham. I think you're gonna be in trouble.
Any questions for Representative O'Brien?
Where does rural Vermont and maybe Maddie Nova stand on cannabis farmers potentially losing crops, so explain whether?
Well, they wouldn't be eligible for a fund like this. The Vermont Growers Association, who we work with through the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition, did stand up a fund similar to NOFA's last year to support some of these farmers who were impacted. I think Vermont Growers Association would be the best organization to talk with about now, as they were probably fielding responses directly from that community in that time, and they went to the trouble of doing that. So I can't speak to sort of estimated losses or a broader statement from representing that community. Yeah.
Other questions? I'll ask you just because you're here, but could ask anybody who's testifying, I guess, about the board, the makeup of the board, and right now the way that it's spelled out, there'd be two farmers who have in the past been recipients of relief funding. How important is that?
Having farmers in general on the panel, or the part about them having been past recipients of relief funding?
Or latter, yeah, having that additional requirement.
Well, I think, most of the decisions, I should say almost all the decisions we made in this bill have been made as a coalition, as a group. So I think the question, the most appropriate way for me to respond would be to bring that question back to the coalition and for us to be able to discuss it and come up with a response for you. But I think as Maddie said, a lot of these folks have direct experience, and part of the intention in bringing farmers on was to make sure we have folks who have gone through this at the table. Yeah, maybe that's the most I'll say for now. And as we reflect, we can comment more. There's been some different suggestions for the makeup of that committee, as well as, this discussion around, as you all were talking about, as you asked Maddie at the end there around mechanisms to sort of control access to the fund or make sure that it can be more equitably distributed, given especially like potentially not having enough money to meet the need. And those are all conversations I think we need to have more in the coalition as well, depending on the action steps you all determine you want to take.
I would just add, again, for the record, I think that it was important to the folks in the coalition that there be farmers who have access to some form of relief funding on the review board, because they can speak to the experience of, suffering from impacts of extreme weather, all of the various, layers of bureaucracy often involved in seeking any form of disaster relief or, insurance needs, et cetera. So having that perspective, really present and participating in the is more important to our organizations.
All right, thank you, Graham. We'll let you go.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'll let you leave the chair anyway.
Thank you. We were hearing today that the sap is running better today in Adamant where we were than it has all year.
Oh,
And
good,
you're at sugar. We get back out.
good. How many taps?
Juniper's daycare is doing, I don't know how many taps you all are doing, June? So they used to do 1,000 taps, I think, but now that they're doing an education program.
That's a busy preschoolers.
Yeah.
Maybe water.
Impressive, yes.
I bet they can't even count that high.
Well, have fun with that. And Vern, if you're there and want to come on. Yep.
Sure. Thank you. And are there others waiting to testify? I can't see from here.
Well, I think we've got Bruce, who's gonna maybe be the last one, but we've got, and I don't want to suggest that we are indifferent to your schedules and timing either, but we have time. So
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I'm here to serve you. I did submit a slideshow. I think I'll show some of it to bring this all to life and maybe a little bit of a longer time frame view, but I won't dwell on it since you have it in your folders as well. And it's a pleasure to be back with you. I visited with you several weeks ago about the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association. And as you know, I am the vegetable and berry specialist, been with UVM Extension, working with farmers in Vermont for 35 years and still learn something every day. And sure learned a lot from some of these major weather events. In the early years, we had droughts, we had some heavy rain, there's always hail, but it really was the 3 major floods in the last 13 years that I think kind of riveted our attention on the need for some more coordinated support for farmers when we have these events. I'm going to show this. So I hope you can all see that.
Yep, we do see it.
So I'm going to give this to you from my perspective, which is in my role working with horticulture farms primarily. And our farms are scattered throughout the state and through the region, and we have a pretty solid network of communication. So when an event happens, it's pretty easy to tap the pulse quickly and find out about the level of losses and needs and what people are going through. So I'm sort of feeding that back out to you. These 3 events I'm talking about were Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, and then the events that have been talked about so far today. And they were all different. And I imagine all the extreme weather events that come at us in the future will also vary widely. We were really surprised by Irene for a number of reasons. We hadn't had an event that extreme, at least in my career. And the fact that it was so statewide and that the forecast didn't really give us an accurate heads up that was coming. And then 2023 was also statewide, but came much earlier in the growing season and was followed by that freeze and was followed by intense rainfall. So many farms were more affected by the ongoing rain than the flood itself. And of course, 24 was extremely intense, but in a much smaller area, also early in the season. Our region has a changing weather pattern. This was predicted by the climate scientists and reports that came out, early in my tenure, that the Northeast was going to get wetter. Winters would get warmer. We're going to have more intense precipitation events. The data show that over the last century, and certainly came true in 23. When you look at those dark green counties having 10 to 15 inches above normal, that's a lot of extra rain. And it's something I think we need to be expecting. The data collection is interesting because it has not been consistent in how it's been collected, and that is something I think this bill would help support going forward. 2011, we really relied on FSA self-reporting by farmers, and you can see the incredible number of acres affected and 476 farms, a gross underestimate of the losses for whatever reason, the way that was collected. Then the Agency of Ag had this dashboard and BGAP applications, and Maddie already went over those numbers. But every time this happens, it's a huge impact on a certain number of farms. That's largely a function of how widespread across the state the event was. And I don't know how many of you were around in Irene, but it was really something. So even if your farm didn't suffer a physical loss itself, as was mentioned earlier, maybe there was no transportation to your farm for a week or more. And if you're trying to ship milk, or you have vegetables in storage, there were losses incurred through that. Markets were upset. The power was out for a really long time in a lot of places, and that affects everything. Every food product that has to be kept cold affects watering animals and crops. There's a lot of other functions in the community affected beyond agriculture too. So a lot of different entities vying for support and resources. But the farms were really hit hard. Again, I'm coming from a horticultural perspective. There's a lot of that production down in the flat river bottom lands because the soil is deep and fertile and there's access to water, and development's not easy. But this was just kind of staggering. When a river rises 20 feet and takes away parts of your field, some farms had to move completely. This was in one of the more recent events up in Hardwick, and it was a rented farm, but that farmer has picked up and started elsewhere. The farmland is just simply gone. Other farms have to deal with soil being deposited on their fields. They didn't lose land, but suddenly there's a layer of something. Maybe it may be fertile, maybe it isn't, but it's at least got to be leveled off and moved around a lot. And there were some farms completely wiped out. Evening Song Farm in Cuttingsville, I had just visited. It was a beautiful 5-acre organic vegetable farm at beginning farmers, and that farm had been there for generations, and the river just simply moved and took the whole field away. You can see a little bit of the remnant of the greenhouse in the background there. And Ryan and Kara got some community support back then, and they ended up moving their farm uphill and are doing well, thankfully. But it was just an incredible, extreme event in terms of, you wouldn't think a river would move that much after 200 years, but it's possible. There was a lot of erosion far away from the rivers, up on the hillsides. Surface water was so intense, just carrying soil downhill. And then in some places, the field itself, the soil wasn't affected, just the crops were. And so tremendous loss of livestock feed, just flattened, unable to harvest, or maybe not flattened, but too much possibility of mycotoxins to be able to feed it. And of course, Extension did a lot of work trying to help farmers do assessments and figure out what the risks were. A real eye-opener with Irene was the impact of flooding on food safety, or at least the perceived impact. We did not know that FDA requires or considers any edible portion of a crop that touches floodwater to be contaminated. And it doesn't matter if it's a baby carrot that was flooded for 5 minutes, it's all unmarketable. So some of this is simply food quality that there's just too much silt on this to make it economically worthwhile to wash it and try and sell it, even if you were allowed to. But then there are other crops that look pretty good. And when it's butternut squash or potatoes or things that are going to get cooked and peeled, horticulture is sort of has injury added to insult to injury, that now these crops are recovering, but you've got to throw them away. And there's no compensation for growers, and this can be hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional losses to the physical damage of the floods. Livestock, I don't know if Bruce is here, but yeah, it's definitely scary when animals are at risk and water comes up. Lots of infrastructure damage, not just barns collapsing, and there are things moved around and made unusable or requiring lots of cleaning before they can be used again. So there are a lot of fields where farmers expect them to flood sometime. Historically, it was sort of those early spring floods. And the tension we have is, there's some sentiment that these are too risky, we shouldn't farm there. On the other hand, they're a great place to grow food. As I said, they're flat, they're fertile, they're near water. Can't put houses on them. I mean, I'm not ready to give up, and I don't think farmers are either, although they are making very rational assessments about where the risk is too high for certain kinds of crops, getting out of annually tilled row crops and putting in permanent sods, or putting in sequential plantings of greens that aren't at risk for the whole season because they get harvested every month and a half or so. And there are some fields just coming out of production if it's deemed too risky for that operation. But I don't think it makes sense, if our goals are to do a better job of feeding ourselves, to take these lands out of production in one fell swoop. Flooding also doesn't just happen down in the typical river bottoms. This was up in Bolton, where a huge amount of rainfall was caught in this mountain bowl, and these small streams just completely overwhelmed the fields and destroyed crops. So that the impacts varied with the timing and what people were growing. I mean, Irene is interesting because it came so late in the year that vegetable farms had done a lot of harvesting and made some money, and it was a big loss, but it wasn't the same as those losses in July, where you have all those stranded costs in the field. You've invested in growing these plants and the seeds and all the labor, and nothing's been sold yet. It's a lot harder to navigate and keep your crew on and things like that. Whereas that late August effect is a lot tougher on the livestock farms because you're waiting for the feed. I mean, there've been some cuts of hay, but certainly with corn, you're waiting for it to mature and get harvested. And it really bounced around the state of who got hit in which of these events, and not that many farms actually were hit by all three, but there are some, and especially if you're, the lower end of the Winooski, it's going to happen, but not the entire farm. Again, it's Paul Mazza. I mean, a really productive farm, mature blueberries, got a tree fruit down there, and the water just really came up high and took away crops that were ready to harvest. So it's very large losses. This has been covered by Maddie, but I do want to reiterate that BGAP was so important to farmers because of the amount of money it offered. The NOFA fund is great. It's quick. It was the quickest, but it's a small amount of money. So if you lost $250,000, the 5K doesn't make as much of a dent as if you're a much smaller farm. The Vermont Community Foundation was interesting. So I was on the review board for their grants, both after Irene and in 2023. And I think that's a good model for the bill before you. They took applications in from around the state. They had a panel of diverse representation, including farmers. Decisions were made very quickly. Checks were cut very quickly. And it was really helpful to farmers, but the cap was $10,000. So that, wasn't enough to really help the bigger losses where BGAP came in. Interesting, in 2023, they had to kind of reinvent their whole grant making infrastructure. All the people that had been involved after Irene had left, and I guess there wasn't a record of how it all worked. So that is one thing that appeals to me about this bill, to codify the system so we don't have to set it up again and again every time after these events. The insurance has been covered. I do want to make clear, in horticulture, most crops are not insurable. There's peaches, there's sweet corn, apples. That's about it. Everything else comes under this disaster payment, NAP, which is not really insurance, is pennies on the dollar. The forage crops corn and hay, can get some coverage here, but the systems are complicated and don't pay a lot. And work should continue to make those better. And as I said in the testimony to the Senate, I view this bill as kind of like setting up your permanent emergency room. We want the other things to work, the preventative care where farmers do a better job planning against risk of where they plant and what they plant, that they have other sources of funding, like support from their peers, plants coming in. And I just want to get to, and donations. So some farms are going to be able to get that quick money with a GoFundMe or some other campaign. And I think farmers would prefer not to take government money if they can. That you hear that loud and clear. So I don't see this as a fund that people would take advantage of. And if they have alternate sources of funding, I think they would go to those first. So we've heard about people changing what they're doing on these higher risk fields. They're also definitely looking for fields that don't flood. In horticulture, there's a lot of continued movement into these high tunnels or plastic covered non-permanent greenhouses to protect against extreme weather in general, but they're also usually placed out of the floodplain if possible. And they're changing up their markets, looking at their infrastructure. So there's been a lot of learning and adapting, which I think, will reduce the losses potentially. Certainly won't eliminate them, but it's not like farmers aren't chipping in to try and reduce the amount of damage that will occur. And I will just quickly say we sampled flooded and non-flooded fields, partly because of this whole produce safety concern lifted up by FDA's rules. And although it was not, it was sort of a landscape scan is the way I say it, but we had 8 or 9 paired farms after each event. And we did not find any red flags with whether it's heavy metals or E. coli or fossil fuel residues. So that's kind of the good news, although more research is definitely needed to solidify that conclusion. So the recommendations that I see after going through these events is certainly number 2, they're having a permanent emergency fund would be really helpful to get significant amounts of fund out quickly. So as Maddie said, people can keep their crews, can keep their markets, know that they're not going to have to wait 9 months or a year. I mean, you hear these things about insurance payments where people are still waiting from 2023. And certainly fewer entities to apply for might reduce the need for a single reporting form. But right now, as it is, you give the same information to all 3 or 4 entities that you can potentially get funding for, and you're already exhausted from the event itself and the aftermath. It seems unnecessary. So that's really what I have for you. We did put together a whole checklist for all kinds of disasters, whether it's wind, hail, drought, flood. There's some basic things like having a communication network that doesn't rely on telephone lines if they go down, moving towards more passive sources of energy to pump water and keep things cold. So it's a simple 2-pager for farmers that I think still resonates, even though it was done after Irene.
Thank you, Vern. We have a question from Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Yeah, Vern, when you tested for contamination, and I hesitate to ask, but did you test for PFAS?
No, that was beyond the scope of our funding and lab capacity. And the tricky thing with a lot of these, well, with everything you test for, right, you're going to find it. There's the levels of detection. The limits of detection are very low. So we found small amounts of fossil fuels in flooded and non-flooded fields. You find them in your backyard too. The question is what number, is significant. And for some of these things, there are standards in agriculture, and for many there aren't. So you're kind of looking at other, residential construction sites or where are there standards, but we didn't find anything above what I would call a dull roar in what we looked for, but no, we did not look for everything, including PFAS.
Thank you.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Just quickly, Werner, maybe Maddie. If you had an accessory on-farm business that was hit by the floods, could you apply to BGAP for either in the ag or commerce?
I would imagine at least in commerce, but I think that would be a good question for that agency. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't recall. I mean, yeah, it was all in commerce. It, my recollection is it was pretty straight up agricultural income that was covered. So even there's, there's light processing where someone takes popcorn and puts it into bags, dries it and puts it into bags, which is still clearly an agricultural crop. And then you get into, if you're actually making food products. So I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be a good thing to clarify if it isn't yet in this bill, Maddie. I don't remember.
Not specified.
Vern, you alluded to the Vermont Community Foundation's work back in 2011, and that they had enough turnover there that there wasn't any or not much institutional memory. I'm wondering whether, it makes me wonder whether whoever was part of that 15 years ago now was still around and could be tapped. And maybe you were able to talk to people who were part of that, just thinking about how to structure, a program.
Yeah. Well, Chuck Ross was the Secretary of Ag at the time, and he kind of spearheaded that coalition. So the Agency of Agriculture was really supporting that effort, and they had some widespread publicity to help the money roll in. I mean, one thing that excites me about this bill is that this fund could take philanthropic donations, right? So again, instead of people being confused about who do I donate to, where do I go, there'd be a central location. But then Lawrence Miller, the former Secretary of Economic Development, was organized this for the Vermont Community Fund in 2023. So it was very rigorous but quick. There were Schedule Fs, there were W-9s, there were a tight application form that made the producer really spell out what their situation was. And the interesting thing with having farmers farmers are the most skeptical and rigorous reviewers of all. I find like they really don't want the system to be worked by anybody. So it became pretty obvious. There was hardly any of that. I think the harder question sometimes is when you have a small farm, asking for $10,000 that had a $20,000 loss, and then you got another farm right next to it that had a $200,000 loss. There wasn't the proportionality built into that system, and that's just a tough one. And I think the big challenge I think with this you all raised earlier, right, is how to be fair about the total ask that's coming in, the timing. I mean, I think the bill is well crafted, but it's not going to be perfect, right? Some farmers will be just too distracted and upset to get their application. And even that, we saw that with BGAP. Farms that really should have applied never did. They either didn't want to or weren't able to, but delaying the payment is a big concern, because that's what we heard loud and clear is the biggest problem with all of the other sources other than a GoFundMe or the NOFA fund is that they take so long to come in, and farmers are trying to keep their workers in their markets, and they're trying to replant and get equipment fixed, and they just need that cash flow quickly after the event.
All right. We thank you, Vern.
You're welcome.
And I guess we'll see if Bruce wants to come up.
Sorry, so don't you let me back in. Oh, yeah.
That video is not essential.
Let's do so it's over here. Slides.
I don't. Hello, I'm Bruce Hennessy from Maple Wind Farm in Richmond, Vermont. We are heading into our 27th season on the farm in this iteration. So we've been around for a while. Very, very quick introduction to what we're doing. This is our mission. You'll see in the first sentence, we exist to promote the health and welfare of our community. And we do think of ourselves as a community asset, and we believe that our community feels that we are a community asset. That's important, and I think in this discussion, we produce 100% grass-fed beef, pasture-raised turkey. How to get rid of this, but
Yeah,
it's just the way it is. Okay. Pasture-raised non-GMO pork, laying hens for eggs, and and broiler chickens, all on a daily move program on pasture during the growing season. We also have a very small USDA poultry and pork processing plant. And we'll do about 40,000 birds through that plant this year, and along with 2,000 to 3,000 turkeys and about 15,000 pounds of pork getting processed into value-added products. So down to the brass tacks, we are one of those farms that experienced flooding in all three of those events that Vern mentioned. We are kind of deep down in the Winooski River Valley. In 2023, we knew that this was here, and we were following the flow forecast on an hourly basis. This is what the flow looked like in kind of a moderate level. The prediction was that it would peak at midnight that night and then head down. And we made our decisions based on this flow forecast. The actual flow went 8 feet higher than this, and it wasn't over for another 24 hours. So the next morning, this is what we found. Bert had one of the pictures from that. We fully had expected that where we put all of our animals was 100% safe. That was not true. As a result, I made the very poor decision to try to drive my tractor in to save our turkeys into floodwaters that was too high. And so in addition to losing the birds, we also lost a 100 horsepower tractor. And then we got our canoes out and went out and tried to save as many as we could. Those birds that are lying there are not dead. They're just very, very cold from the water. We recovered there were about 540 birds out there, and we recovered about 140. So we also were impacted by the 2024, and I'll talk about that. Matter of fact, I'll go forward and after that, I'm sorry, I've got itchy fingers here. So after 2023, we wrote a flood response plan. And what that entailed is much more detailed than this, but we were always going to be following the NOAA weather forecast and never trust it. We would add an additional 20% onto any flow forecast that we saw. We identified all of our 100% safe areas, and we decided not to operate in areas that were not 100% safe. And then we started moving based on the forecast 3 days ahead of time, so we had enough time to get animals out of the way if we did have all our boats and tools on hand, because in 2023 we had to go searching for canoes and paddles and things like that to get around. So the result in 2024 was that we didn't lose any animals. We had a lot of fence and water system culvert damage, but we did not lose any animals. As a result of all of our planning in this respect, we took a third of our primary production land out of production.
which was a major hit and has been a major financial issue for us. So,
Brian, question?
I'm sorry,
How did the high water differ in the 2 years? About the
it was
same.
almost the same. It was basically the same, and the only difference is that because we had made the decision after the 2023 flood not to operate in that field, in a primary way, we still used it a little bit. I mean, in 2023, we had 4,000 broilers down there, 540 turkeys, and we were raising cattle, et cetera, et cetera. And that's full production. And in 2024, we didn't even have any animals down there at that time. We did end up using that ground for the end of our turkey grazing season and for pigs. So this is the assistance that we received, and my apologies. The BGAP money, we should also add, we did get the Vermont Community Fund money, so that 21K does also include the BGAP money that we got. We had a major problem with the USDA livestock indemnity program. Our county committee made the decision that we had made decisions that caused the loss of our livestock. And that was extremely difficult to hear, since we worked so hard to prevent that from happening. And we did appeal that all the way up to the state level and finally won that appeal a full year later. We received $11,000 for that livestock indemnity. The lost income was $82,000. Just to give you an idea.
Who was the organization who said you?
It's the USDA FSA Livestock Indemnification Program, LIE, or LIP, and the FSA County Committee makes the determination of whether you qualify or not.
Who sits on that county committee?
Those are elections. Farmers across the county vote for people to be on that board.
On a county level FSA board.
Yeah. And then the state, I'm not sure what they call the state FSA committee, is over them. And then you can also appeal to the federal level, but the state committee did for us.
And this is probably not the time to be delving into and pulling out a thread of something that I've never heard of before, and we have lots of questions about, but something to flag anyway.
Yes. And in 2023, we applied for flood disaster loan to help us bridge the gap of what we had lost, which total losses here for both years, $177,000, just to give you that idea. So 2024, no animal losses. However,
I'm sorry.
1 month after.
Representative Nelson, did you have a question?
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Where is your farm located? Is it upstream of Richmond Village? or
Yes, just upstream.
Just upstream.
Like not even a mile upstream
Okay.
from the main village. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
A month later, we kind of congratulated ourselves on having a plan that worked. 2024, even though we did have some losses there. Tropical cyclone Debbie touched down with a microburst on our land and dropped 3 giant cottonwoods on top of our equipment barn and destroyed our equipment barn. This 67,000 isn't all the equipment barn. That also included all of our road, culvert, fence and water system repairs that we need to do. So, right after that, I had a staff of 7 or 8, just at the end of that day, and we saw this happen, completely flattened our equipment barn. Had a tractor in there, the whole thing. And we went around and said, oh my gosh, I wonder what happened to all of our other operations. These are our mobile range coops that we move daily onto new grass with birds and everything. Everything was okay, and we saw this double rainbow. And to me, that represents, that really the only thing we can control in our life is how we respond to this. Right? And I think that's true, not just for our farm, but on a community and state level. Should be on the federal level as well. I was going to say that we also applied for an FSA emergency disaster relief loan at 3%. They ran out of money before we got that loan, and it took over a year to receive a loan at a higher interest rate to help us with bridging those cost problems. That's the video that I can't play.
There was a lot of dollars in agricultural loss down there, huge grass on it, Cameron Clark.
So I should also say that we also had a very localized storm that caused similar damage to our farm in 2019, where we lost a lot of livestock. I know the Conants had a major loss in December of 2023. We've had 4 200-year flood events in the last 6 years. So, we're still doing things down in that field. We're starting to, we're using this for pig and turkey grazing on a very limited basis. We're trying to reduce compaction. We're trying to build soils down there using rip sowing to get through the compaction zone and to build diversity in here. We lost a third of our production ground, and therefore we lost about a third of our production. And our answer to that was to do a couple of things. One was to turn almost exclusively to direct-to-consumer sales and to use partner farms that met our protocols to fill in the gaps where we couldn't produce all of what we used to produce on our farm. So we get grass-fed beef from 3 different partner farms that operate in the same way that we do. We do even go out and buy chicken from other farms that operate that we do. We had bought turkeys from farms that operate on the same level that we do. And we also started looking at our waste. Everything that we used to put in the compost pile, almost everything that we used to put in the compost pile, we're now pulling out and making into high value nutrient dense pet treats for dogs and cats. So this is a new. So these are some of the initiatives that came out of these flood events and our problem solving as a team to try to get there. And then Vern mentioned that that the continuous rains after these events have had a major impact on the vegetable side of things. It's also had a major impact on livestock, just the health of livestock, and a low level pathogenic bacteria load in the environment and viral load in the environment. And so we started looking into ways to mitigate that. And right now we're working on an experiment of using lactobacillus or lactic acid bacteria sprayed daily into our shelters to flip over the microbiome in our shelters to combat avian influenza and other pathogens in the environment to increase the health and fight against the risk of avian influenza. So these are some of the things that we're doing. We received just under $17,000 from BGAP, which represented 30% of our loss in 2024 because of that microburst. We spent that money already on repairing fence and water systems and culverts and roads and demoing the barn that had come down. But there's no possible way that we can rebuild that barn. which we need. Going forward. We already have more loans in than we want to handle or can handle. And we're in a situation where we just don't have the funding available to us, the capital available to us to go forward. This, and I know that this fund could never make somebody entirely whole. I think that's unrealistic to expect, but a higher percentage and the ability to do this very quickly. We lost a lot of time and effort from August 10th to November when we finally got funds and were able to start to demo the barn and work on our roads and fence and water systems. Which, this is just extremely difficult to move forward in that environment. As I said, we're a community asset, and I believe we should. It's not about me and my lovely wife who we operate the farm together. This is about Maple Wind Farm as a community asset going forward, being a resource for other farms, selling other farms' products as well as our own, and providing really nutrient-dense, extremely healthy food for our community. And we think it's worth perpetuating through these programs. But thank you for your support, and good luck pushing it all through the legislature.
What breed of cows are that?
Sorry?
What breed of cows is this red one?
Those are Devon Angus,
Yeah.
Devon Angus cross, yeah.
They,
Go ahead.
they are wonderful in a pasture race system.
Yeah.
I
That's right.
have a friend of mine that raced some down Brandon. Yeah, just,
They're awesome. They're talk about grass-based genetics.
yeah, they're.
They're the epitome.
Chris, do you, you're familiar with the bill? I don't know if you've been following it.
A little bit, yeah.
Anything to do with writing it in the first place, but we talked about this earlier. It calls for a couple of farmers to be on the board. Is that something that you would? I'm just thinking, who would be able to do that? Not necessarily who would want to serve, but who would have the capacity, not knowing, when things are going to happen.
Right.
That the whole point is to have a quick turnaround,
Right.
so people need to be available. Is it something that you would be able to take on?
If we,
I'm not inviting you to do it, but
Right.
just,
if we were, right, it doesn't even exist, right? So, if we were not impacted, yes. If we were impacted, I don't think so.
With the issue of, if he's on that board and he's impacted, then if he can't speak to it because he's impacted, it's almost like that needs to be maybe broader scope and farmers from different parts of the state. And you hope we don't have another 23 event that gets most of us.
Yes.
You have, like Irene never affected us. Not even, nothing. We were lucky. We were lucky. Last year, we got hit pretty hard in 23, terrible, like you were. But almost you gotta have that availability. So if you have, say, Bruce and one of the Conants on it, and they're not affected, but the Northeast Kingdom gets it, or if something finally ever hits up in Franklin County, which seems to be immune from about everything. But some,
Occasionally they get some drought up there.
yeah. Well, Addison County gets everything.
Right.
But, they could have the flexibility of saying, okay, we can't use you guys because you're affected. We're gonna reach out to these farmers here. I'm just throwing things out there because there is that, is it a conflict of interest? And
Yeah, I mean, I would think I would just recuse myself.
Sure.
Part of that.
so then we don't have a farmer on the board, but if we build some resiliency into it.
no, I think that's a good point.
Or a farmer who's been through it already, but now perhaps has some available time to do it.
Yeah, no, but
I am retiring sometime soon. Yeah. Next 4 or 5 years.
it's just having that, farmers never retire.
That's true.
Just get plowed out.
I don't, yeah, that's kind of my plan.
Representative Lipsky.
Another way of looking at that would be to have alternate members to commissions or boards to serve when it's necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. We have.
It could be written.
Yeah, yeah. We have some time tomorrow morning. We're scheduled to meet at 9. And I think what we'll do for that first half hour or so is have a discussion about testimony we've heard so far on this bill. I mean, somebody mentioned preaching to the choir, and I think that to a certain extent, that's probably true. We're not necessarily here to always advocate for particular industry, but we've heard enough that I think we get it, and we'll want to think about, it's 8 pages of language, and is it the right language throughout those 8 pages or 11 pages, whatever it is. So I think maybe we'll wrap it up for this afternoon and thank our witnesses who came in for their insightful testimony. And unless you had anything you wanted to end
I
with.
just wanted to mention that I did give you folks a letter of support for the bill, as well as this deck if you need more information.
It's on our page, yeah, so we can see that too. All right.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, you bet.